Frank Sullivan never expected to become a farmer at 45, but when his uncle passed away and left him 20 acres of land on the outskirts of Meadowbrook Heights, he saw it as a chance to escape his corporate job and pursue the simple life he'd always secretly wanted. The property came with a modest farmhouse, a large barn, and fields that had lain fallow for years. Despite knowing nothing about agriculture, Frank was determined to make it work. He spent his evenings researching sustainable farming practices and his weekends clearing overgrown fields. What Frank didn't realize was that during the years his uncle's land had sat unused, the neighboring luxury housing development had expanded, and its homeowners association had begun to view the neglected property as an extension of their community space. When Frank arrived with his moving truck and plans for organic vegetable farming, the Meadowbrook Heights HOA president, Veronica Winters, was there to greet him with a folder of community guidelines and a condescending smile. "Mr. Sullivan, I presume?" Veronica's voice was honey-coated, but her eyes were calculating as she extended a manicured hand. "We're so pleased to finally meet the new owner of this charming property." Frank shook her hand wearily. "Just Frank is fine. And thanks, I'm excited to get started here." Veronica's gaze swept over his moving truck with barely disguised disdain. "I'm sure you're aware that your property borders our prestigious Meadowbrook Heights community. We have certain standards that all neighboring properties are expected to maintain." She thrust the folder into his hands. Frank flipped it open to find color-coded tabs and laminated pages detailing everything from acceptable fence heights to approved exterior paint colors. "I appreciate the welcome wagon, but this is agricultural land," Frank said, closing the folder. "It's not part of your HOA." Veronica's smile tightened. "Oh, but we've had such a wonderful arrangement with your uncle for years." He understood the importance of community harmony. Frank raised an eyebrow. "My Uncle Pete?" The same man who once threatened to release a swarm of bees at a town council meeting when they tried to tell him he couldn't keep chickens. "Well, perhaps not initially," Veronica admitted, "but we came to an understanding, particularly regarding the community's use of the northwest corner. It's become quite the beloved amenity." Before Frank could question this further, a Range Rover pulled up behind Veronica's Mercedes. A man in golf attire stepped out, waving cheerfully. "Ah, Veronica, is this our new neighbor? Has he signed off on the campsite agreement yet?" Frank's confusion must have shown on his face because Veronica quickly intervened. "Richard, perhaps we should let Mr. Sullivan settle in before discussing the finer points of our arrangement." "What campsite?" Frank asked. Veronica smiled thinly. "Nothing to worry about right now. Just a small area your uncle generously allowed us to use for community recreation. We'll discuss it once you're settled." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and do review those guidelines carefully. We'd hate to see any unfortunate misunderstandings." As Veronica drove away, Frank stood in the driveway of his new home, the folder heavy in his hands. Something told him his dream of a quiet farming life had just hit its first major complication. 3 months into Frank's new farming venture, he began noticing strange activity on the far corner of his property, near a wooded area that bordered the housing development. Expensive camping equipment kept appearing: tents, portable grills, even a volleyball net. When he investigated, he found a laminated sign reading Meadowbrook Heights Community Campsite, staked into what was definitely his land. "What the hell is this?" Frank muttered, yanking the sign from the ground. He noticed freshly trampled grass, a fire pit ringed with expensive-looking stones, and several trash bags neatly tied and left by a tree, clearly expecting someone to pick them up. Frank immediately called Veronica, his knuckles white around his phone. Oh, that. Veronica's laugh tinkled through the speaker. I was going to discuss this with you. The community campsite has been such a wonderful tradition. Tradition. This is private property, Frank said. Your uncle allowed it for years, Veronica explained with practiced patience. It's an understood arrangement. The families only use it on weekends, and they're very respectful. I never agreed to this. I'm in the middle of establishing crops in that area. But surely you can work around it. It's just a small corner. The children so look forward to their camping adventures. Frank drove into town that afternoon, returning with copies of his property deed. He emailed scans to Veronica, highlighting the clear boundaries. A response came within minutes. While I appreciate your thoroughness, we have precedent on our side. Your uncle never objected to our community enjoyment of that space. In fact, we have photos of him attending our summer campfire event 3 years ago. Frank checked his calendar. He had a meeting with the local agricultural extension office the next day to discuss irrigation options. The campsite issue would have to wait. Friday night, Frank was awakened by headlights sweeping across his bedroom ceiling. He glanced at the clock. 11:27 p.m. Pulling on a robe, he stepped onto his porch to see a procession of luxury SUVs driving along his access road. By dawn, the noise had become unbearable. Frank pulled on his work boots and trudged across his property. He counted 7 tents, 3 canopies, and what appeared to be a portable movie screen being set up by a man in what had to be $300 hiking boots. "Excuse me," Frank called out. "This is private property. You need to pack up and leave." A woman in designer athleisure wear looked up from her camp stove. "Oh, you must be the new owner. Veronica told us you were fully on board with the community use agreement." She extended a hand. "I'm Margaret Wilson, HOA Social Committee Chair. We brought extra coffee if you'd like some." "There is no agreement," Frank said firmly. "This is a working farm, not a recreation area." The friendly faces around him hardened. A man stepped forward, smartphone in hand. "Veronica said you might be difficult. She suggested we show you this." He held up his phone, displaying a photo of Frank's uncle sitting by a campfire, raising a beer with several Meadowbrook Heights residents. "One photo doesn't constitute an easement," Frank said. "Well," Margaret said, her smile now brittle, "Veronica also suggested we remind you that our HOA has a very good legal team, and adverse possession laws in this state are quite favourable to established use cases like ours." Frank stood there, surrounded by strangers on his own land, the smell of their gourmet coffee mingling with the scent of freshly tilled soil from his fields. Frank tried the diplomatic approach first. He attended the next HOA meeting, held in the Meadowbrook Heights clubhouse, a building with soaring ceilings, stone fireplaces, and windows overlooking the community's private golf course. Frank felt conspicuously out of place in his work jeans and flannel shirt among the crowd of designer-clad homeowners. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak," Frank began, standing at the podium after Veronica reluctantly acknowledged him. "While I understand there's been some confusion about the use of my property for camping, I need to clarify that I'm actively farming that land now. I can't have unauthorized people trampling my fields, leaking trash, and creating fire hazards." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. "My crops are literally my livelihood," Frank continued. "I'm sure you all can understand." "What kind of crops?" interrupted a balding man from the front row. "Because we've noticed some rather unsightly tilling on the property line. It's affecting property values." "Organic vegetables," Frank replied. "Heirloom varieties, that. Will there be smells?" A woman in tennis whites cut in. "My daughter's wedding is next spring, and we're planning an outdoor reception. I won't have it ruined by farm odours." Veronica tapped her gavel. "Let's focus, everyone. Mr. Sullivan, while we appreciate your agricultural ambitions, you must understand that the Meadowbrook Heights aesthetic is paramount to maintaining our community standards. The campsite has been an integral part of our recreational offerings since before you arrived." "It's on my property," Frank said firmly. "Not yours." "Perhaps," said a man who introduced himself as the HOA's attorney, "we could discuss a formal easement agreement. The HOA would be willing to compensate you, within reason, for continued access." Frank shook his head. "I'm not interested in selling access. I need that land for my farm operation." The polite veneer in the room evaporated instantly. "Do you have any idea what your farm operation is doing to homes that overlook your property?" demanded one homeowner. "I paid $1.2 million for unobstructed views, not to watch you dig in the dirt." "Our children have been camping there for years," added another resident. "You're selfishly ending a community tradition." Veronica leaned forward, her smile tight. "If you want to be a good neighbour, Frank, you'd not only continue to allow the camping, but also modify your farming plans to be less visually disruptive." The meeting devolved from there, with homeowners taking turns explaining exactly how Frank's farm offended them. On his way out, Frank overheard a group discussing strategies to make the farmer see reason. The next day, Frank consulted with a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. The lawyer reviewed his case and sighed heavily. "You're legally in the right," she explained, "but these cases can be expensive and drawn out. The HOA has deep pockets and can drag this through the courts for years." Frank nodded grimly. "What about posting no trespassing signs? Sending formal cease and desist letters?" "Those are good first steps," the lawyer agreed. "Document everything. Take photos of trespassers, but be prepared for resistance." That evening, Frank hammered private property. No trespassing signs around the perimeter of his land. He then drafted a letter to the HOA board, explaining that the next weekend would be the last time he would tolerate camping on his property. After that, he would take necessary actions to secure his land. The HOA's response came swiftly. An email blast went out to all Meadowbrook Heights residents announcing a community solidarity campout for the upcoming weekend. Veronica personally called over 30 families, encouraging them to participate and show support for preserving neighbourhood traditions. The message was clear. The HOA was doubling down. Frank knew he was dealing with people who wouldn't respond to reason, so he began formulating a plan. His research into sustainable farming had led him to explore natural fertilization methods, including the use of manure and organic waste composting. As luck would have it, he had just received a delivery of liquid manure from a neighbouring dairy farm, several thousand gallons of it, sitting in a holding tank ready to be diluted and used on his fields. "That's quite the delivery," remarked Ed, the dairy farmer who'd supplied the manure. He leaned against his truck, watching as the last of the liquid was pumped into Frank's storage tank. "Sure you need all that at once?" Frank surveyed the large tank with a thoughtful expression. "Actually, I think the timing is perfect." He explained the situation with the HOA and the scheduled campout that weekend. Ed's weathered face broke into a knowing grin. "Shame about that forecast. Heavy rain coming Saturday night. That kind of downpour tends to create runoff problems." "Does it now?" Frank replied, an idea taking shape. "I suppose I should be concerned about proper drainage." "Absolutely. Environmental responsibility and all that." Ed winked. "You know, I had a similar issue with some city folks who bought the property adjoining my east field. Complained about the smell, tried to get the county to shut me down. Then they had a garden party right on the property line. Weather turned, irrigation system had a malfunction. He shrugged. Never had complaints after that. That evening, Frank studied topographical maps of his property. The so-called campsite was situated at a lower elevation than his main fields, with a gentle slope between. Perfect for gravity-assisted drainage. With the right system of trenches and pipes, he could create a watershed that would activate only during heavy rainfall. And the forecast showed precisely such a storm approaching Saturday night. Friday morning, Frank rented a small backhoe and spent the day digging what appeared to be ordinary drainage ditches, a normal part of farm infrastructure. To any observers from the HOA houses, he looked like a farmer preparing his fields for potential flooding. Only Frank knew that these particular ditches formed a carefully designed network that would channel rainwater directly through his manure-holding area before flowing downhill to the campsite. He installed a series of valves that could be operated remotely from his barn, allowing him to control exactly when and how much of the tank's contents would mix with the rainwater. A few well-placed pipe sections completed the system, all disguised as standard agricultural irrigation equipment. As Saturday morning dawned, Frank watched the first luxury SUVs arriving at the edge of his property. He counted 10, then 15, then 20 vehicles. Families unloaded tents, coolers, portable fire pits, and even a karaoke machine. Veronica supervised it all, occasionally glancing toward Frank's farmhouse with a triumphant smile. Frank smiled back and waved when she looked his way. His unusual friendliness seemed to make her nervous, which pleased him. Around noon, he walked down to the campsite with a basket of freshly picked vegetables from his smaller garden pot. "Peace offering," he announced, setting the basket on a folding table where several HOA members were arranging gourmet snacks. "Thought you might enjoy some fresh produce." The campers exchanged confused glances, clearly thrown by his change in attitude. "Well," Veronica said cautiously, accepting a perfectly ripe tomato, "this is neighbourly of you." "Just trying to make the best of the situation," Frank replied with an innocent smile. "Oh, and I should mention, the weather report is showing rain tonight. Might want to secure your tents well." "We're prepared for a little rain," Veronica assured him, gesturing to several expensive waterproof canopies. "Nothing will dampen our community spirit." Frank nodded, glancing up at the darkening clouds on the horizon. "I'm sure it won't. Enjoy your weekend." As he walked away, he patted the remote control for his drainage system, safely tucked in his pocket. Around 4 p.m., dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. The campers, who had spread out over Frank's property with their Bluetooth speakers, coolers of craft beer, and portable fire pits, started glancing nervously at the sky. Frank, meanwhile, was busy in his barn, making final adjustments to water pumps and checking valve connections. System test complete, he murmured to himself, watching the pressure gauges respond as he opened and closed various valves. Through the barn window, he could see the campsite was still in full swing despite the threatening weather. Someone had even set up a bouncy castle, directly in the path of what would soon be a very unpleasant flow. The first fat raindrops hit the barn roof with audible plops. Frank's phone buzzed with a weather alert. Severe thunderstorm warning for the next 6 hours, with potential flash flooding in low-lying areas. Perfect. He walked up to his farmhouse, making a show of battening down windows and securing loose items from his porch, all while keeping one eye on the campsite. Several families had already packed up and left, but a surprising number remained, huddled under expensive rain shelters, determined to prove that a little weather wouldn't deter their community tradition. Veronica had established her command center under the largest canopy, which was anchored with what looked like professional-grade stakes and equipped with side walls that could be rolled down against the rain. She watched Frank's preparations with a smug smile, clearly interpreting his actions as evidence that the farmers' standoff had reached a stalemate. When the downpour began in earnest, Frank retreated to his barn, ostensibly to check on his equipment. In reality, he was activating the first phase of his plan. He opened the main valve from the manure-holding tank, allowing a measured flow to begin seeping into his drainage channels. The heavy rain would do the rest, carrying the mixture downhill toward the campsite. Through the driving rain, he could hear the sounds of the remaining campers, laughter, music, the occasional shriek as someone made a dash through the downpour. Little did they know what was headed their way. Frank calculated it would take approximately 20 minutes for the first wave of manure-laden water to reach the campsite. He busied himself with other farm tasks, occasionally glancing at his watch. At precisely 7:02 p.m., he heard the first scream. It wasn't the playful sound of people caught in the rain. This was a cry of genuine disgust, followed quickly by another and another. Frank stepped to the barn door just in time to see a woman in designer rain boots leap backward from what she'd clearly assumed was a simple mud puddle, but which had revealed itself to be something far more pungent. "What is that smell?" The voice carried clearly despite the rain, Veronica. Frank watched as the remaining campers began to notice the change in their surroundings. The rain had been falling hard enough to disguise the initial flow, but now that the soil was saturated, brown rivulets were visibly streaming through the campsite, converging in the low spots where, unfortunately for them, most of the tents and canopies had been pitched. A man in what had been pristine hiking gear stepped into a deeper section of the flow and sank ankle-deep in the muck. His howl of revulsion set off a chain reaction as others began to realize what was happening. Parents grabbed children, abandoning expensive equipment in their haste to escape the rising tide of liquefied manure. Veronica herself had been holding court from a folding director's chair, elevated slightly on a plastic platform. She stood up to investigate the commotion, stepped forward, and her designer rain boot sank into what had appeared to be solid ground, but was now a quagmire of mud and manure. She wobbled, arms pinwheeling, before falling spectacularly into the mire with a splash that spattered several nearby HOA board members. The exodus was immediate and complete. Tents were abandoned, coolers left behind, the karaoke machine toppled into the muck as its owner fled. Within minutes, the only sound was the drumming of rain and the gurgle of brown water flowing ever more freely through what had once been the Meadowbrook Heights community campsite. From the shelter of his barn, Frank watched with quiet satisfaction as nature, with a little help from his irrigation system, reclaimed his property. By Monday morning, Frank's phone was ringing non-stop with calls from outraged HOA members. His email inbox was flooded with threats of legal action. Several messages contained photographs of ruined camping equipment, along with itemized lists of replacement costs that they expected him to cover. One particularly irate email included high-resolution images of a pair of Gucci loafers, forever stained despite professional cleaning, with a $950 invoice attached. Frank ignored them all until precisely 9:00 a.m., when Veronica herself appeared at his door. Her normally perfect appearance was noticeably disheveled. Her hair, usually coiffed into a precise bob, looked brittle from what must have been multiple washings. And despite what Frank assumed was an expensive emergency pedicure, there was still a faint dark line under one perfectly manicured nail. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she hissed, not waiting for an invitation to enter. You have deliberately vandalized thousands of dollars of private property. The HOA board has already convened an emergency meeting, and we're pursuing every legal avenue available." Frank leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "Is that so?" Environmental contamination, health code violations, malicious destruction of property. Veronica ticked off on her fingers. "Our attorney believes we may even have grounds for criminal charges." "That's interesting," Frank replied calmly, "because I've just been doing what farmers do, fertilizing my fields using standard agricultural practices." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb. You deliberately flooded our community campsite with, she couldn't bring herself to say the word, with organic fertilizer that was unfortunately carried by rainwater to the lowest part of my property, which you were occupying without permission, I might add." Frank reached for a folder on the side table by his door. "I have here my farming plan filed with the County Agricultural Extension Office last month. Note the highlighted section detailing my fertilization schedule and the specific date in question." He handed her another document. "Here are the permits for my manure storage tank, completely up to code. And another, records showing I followed all proper procedures for organic fertilizer application within the guidelines for sustainable agriculture." Veronica sputtered, "But you knew we were camping there." "Yes," Frank nodded. "I did know that people were trespassing on my clearly marked private property despite multiple verbal and written warnings. According to my lawyer, that means they assumed all risks associated with being on active farmland without permission." Frank handed her one final document, a letter from his attorney explaining exactly this point, along with citations of relevant agricultural zoning laws that protected his farming activities. "You should also know," Frank added, "that I've installed security cameras around my property perimeter. I have time-stamped video of Meadowbrook Heights residents ignoring no trespassing signs and removing some of them. That's a crime in this state." Veronica's face, already pale, went almost white. "This isn't over, Sullivan." "Actually, I think it is." Frank gestured toward her luxury SUV parked in his driveway. "I'd appreciate it if Meadowbrook Heights residents would respect my property boundaries going forward. I'm trying to run a business here." The HOA consulted their lawyers later that day. The news wasn't what they wanted to hear. Agricultural zoning laws did indeed protect Frank's farming activities, and the fact that he had documentation for every step of his fertilizer application made any environmental claims dubious at best. Worse, their encouragement of trespassing despite clear signage left them legally vulnerable. The attorney suggested quietly dropping the matter before Frank decided to countersue. The next morning, Frank discovered the community campsite sign had vanished. A week later, the Meadowbrook Heights monthly newsletter arrived in his mailbox. He'd been added to the distribution list without his permission months ago. It contained no mention of camping activities, but did include a stern warning about respecting private property boundaries and the importance of heeding posted signage. Occasionally, Frank spotted Veronica or other HOA members driving slowly past his farm, their expressions sour as they surveyed his thriving operation. But no one from Meadowbrook Heights ever set foot on his land again. 6 months later, Frank set up a small farm stand at the end of his driveway. To his amusement, many of his best customers turned out to be Meadowbrook Heights residents, drawn by the reputation of his exceptionally flavorful organic produce. They never mentioned the infamous manure incident when purchasing his award-winning tomatoes, though Frank couldn't help but smile whenever Veronica's husband sheepishly stopped by for their weekly vegetable delivery. As for the former community campsite, it became the most fertile section of Frank's farm, producing vegetables of remarkable size and vigor. Frank always took special care with those crops, knowing they were nourished by justice as much as by organic matter.